Okay. My name is Peggy Apthorpe, and I am currently working as an AmeriCorps with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska is the statewide nonprofit that is dedicated to keeping our natural resources healthy. One of the main ways that we do that is through public education programs like the one that we have this evening with Nebraska Game and Parks. We're always very grateful to our presenters and to the organizations that they represent, because we wouldn't be able to do obviously a lot of our programs without them. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know that your microphone is off and your camera is muted. You can put your questions in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the program. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Hunter Nikolai. Hunter is currently the Hunter Education Coordinator for Nebraska Game and Parks. He previously worked as the Nebraska Hunting and Shooting Sports Recruitment, Retention, and Reactivation Coordinator for the National Wild Turkey Federation. He grew up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where he learned to hunt and fish from his father. He graduated from Wisconsin University in Madison with a degree in wildlife ecology, and he is currently living with his wife, Tammy, and his infant son, Augie, in Hickman. So thank you, Hunter, for being here tonight, and we'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Chelsea. As Chelsea said, my name's Hunter Nikolai. I'm the Hunter Education Coordinator here for the Nebraska Game and Parks, and oversee about 600 volunteer hunter education instructors that deliver our state mandated hunter education and bow hunter education programs for our hunters, along with some other responsibilities in the shooting sports and hunting here in Nebraska. So I'm really honored to be here tonight to talk a little bit about the role that hunters in Nebraska and across America play in the conservation of our wildlife species, both game and non-game, and also I'm going to touch briefly on a little bit of the history, but I want to focus more on where we're at today in terms of not only the funding of wildlife conservation, but also how it's impacted by our hunters. So I'm going to jump right in. As Chelsea said, if you have any questions, put them in the comments and we'll address those at the end when we get there. So to start off here, I want to talk a little bit about the prelude to what today is known as the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation and how we manage our wildlife here in Nebraska and here in the United States. And really kind of a stark opposite of what our founding fathers came from, and a lot of what European models still exist today as existed in the 1600s and even before that, where wildlife and hunting was tied generally to land ownership. Wealthy landowners and nobility claimed that wildlife as their own and really had were the only individuals with access to that wildlife. And as immigrants came over to America, as they began exploiting the wildlife, it was very abundant, deer, turkeys, wildlife they had never seen before. And as that exploration continued on, really market hunting or the taking of wildlife for sale of meat and furs and the other animal parts that can be used off certain wildlife really exploded to an extent that I'll show you a picture here in a minute, became a problem for the management of wildlife and certain wildlife populations and the continued existence of those wildlife. And this really didn't kick off until after the Civil War and beginning of the 1800s, when that exploration really advanced into the Western United States and became a driving factor for many. Wildlife and the exploitation of wildlife became a factor and did have some significant impacts here in Nebraska specifically too. Immigrants to Canada and the US wanted wildlife for food, and the market value, the money that it brought when they sold it at trade, particularly beaver fur, bison, elk, deer, meat, and also their furs as well. And as this kind of progressed into the mid 19th century, saw sort of an urbanization in America where folks were starting to condense into urban areas. Cities began to develop at higher levels than they had before. And some of the values of Americans began to change from this market-based exploitation of wildlife to that existed still to feed those folks and still for folks to make a living. But hunting started to become a little bit of a pastime, and those values kind of split. Wildlife still had an economic value, but it also started to become more intrinsic with sportsmen, mostly men at the time as well. And that really kicked off a lot of professors at universities beginning to look at wildlife and wildlife values and what it would take to protect that wildlife, and also individual grassroots organizations and groups of sportsmen that started to create refuges for wildlife to protect them, and eventually get into the late 1800s and as you got to the turn of the century, laws to protect wildlife and promote their interests as well. And that really kicked off at the turn of the 19th century when the decrease in wildlife populations really became apparent to government, to folks out within states and at the federal agency level, and began to establish agencies, dedicate lands to conserve wildlife, national parks, really started to see a split of a preservationist versus a conservationist movement and some key folks there as well. And also the establishment of game laws and initial enforcement coincided. Here's just one picture of a few that just show some of the great lengths of market hunting and how it really decimated certain wildlife populations, especially those seen of value to people in the trades for furs, for meat, and for other things. This is a picture from the Smithsonian of a bison skulls mound. Hundreds of thousands of bison killed, white-tailed deer, turkeys, many other species, wood ducks were hunted to the brink of extinction as a result of market hunting into the mid to late 1800s. And that really kicked off then, as I said before, the establishment of game laws and some initial enforcement. And they really had state agencies started developing game commissions, similar to kind of the beginning of what we have today here with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. But the game laws weren't really enough without funding and infrastructure to enforce them and to make sound decisions to put those in place. In 1930, the American Game Policy was published by Aldo Leopold. And this really was a proposal to assist that legal framework that was already in place, calling for trained biologists, stable funding, so states and the federal government would have the ability to enforce these laws and really make sound decisions to create these laws and regulations that they wanted the general public to follow in order to conserve and maintain healthy wildlife populations. Some other key conservations at the time, Robert Willis Robertson, in 1937, within 10 years of that American Game Policy being published, kind of as a here, take the next step to develop what's needed to conserve our wildlife here in America. The Pittman-Robertson Act was passed, which I'll talk about here in a minute. The Wildlife Society, which is still running up strong today, was established, and the federal duck stamp was created. And I'll also talk about that here on the next slide. And these are really kind of the key pieces of legislation that were built up to establish the North American model of wildlife conservation. In 1900, the Lacey Act was established that prohibited the trade in wildlife, fish, and plants legally taken, and this really put a big stop to market hunting because now the federal government had legislation in place to enforce and prohibit that. In 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed that prohibited the take of protected migratory bird species without authorization by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then the big one here, really the foundation of the North American model of wildlife conservation, was the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937, introduced and passed by Senator T. Pittman and House Member Willis Robertson, which impose an excise tax on the sale of firearms and ammunition to help fund wildlife conservation. And this act, with a few amendments over the years, is really how our wildlife conservation model is funded to this day, nearly 100 years later. So something that would never be passed today, could never be passed today with the current political landscape, view on taxes, but really essential into our model of conservation and how state agencies are funded in order to enhance and conserve our wildlife. And also an important model because it really provides, and for hunters, for conservations in general, a consistent flow of money that allows a lot of these state agencies to do what they do well beyond what they provide for hunters. Then in 1934, the Migratory Bird Hunting and Conservation Stamp Act, or the federal duck stamp, was passed that required waterfowl hunters 16 years of age or older to purchase and possess a federal waterfowl stamp prior to hunting migratory waterfowl. This also is here today, and we'll talk about some modifications of that here in Nebraska a little bit later in this presentation. But a cool opportunity to provide kind of a user pay every public benefit for waterfowl, using those funds that were provided by the purchase of all those hunters purchasing those stamps to hunt waterfowl, to enhance and protect and purchase waterfowl habitat, and that program continues on to this day as well. This is kind of a high level simplification of the Pittman-Robertson, or we call it PR a lot of the time, Act. Really what that imposes is an 11% tax on firearms and ammunition, a 10% tax on pistols, revolvers, and then 11% tax on archery equipment, archery tackle. And that all that money each year that hunters, target shooters, people that purchase firearms in this equipment for home defense, all of that money goes to the Wildlife Restoration Fund with the federal government, and that's allocated back to all 50 states and U.S. territories based on the number of hunters they have in that year and also their land area size. So, and then the states are then required to provide a 25% match to access those funds in order to get reimbursed for those federal dollars. Really provides a lot of money over the course of the last 90 years. It's provided over $15 billion, a billion with a B, back to state fish and wildlife agencies to conserve wildlife, conduct wildlife research, make land acquisitions, you name it, habitat work, any of hunter education, which I oversee. This act was amended in 1970 to introduce the funding of hunter education as that became established in all 50 states. And more recently here to provide funds for the recruitment, retention, and reactivation of hunters as well. In 2022 was a record-breaking year, provided over $1.5 billion back to the states for wildlife management. So really, as it kind of started, the PR Act, most of the money that were purchased for firearms and ammunition were originally from hunters. Today, nearly 75% of the dollars that are coming back to state fish and wildlife agencies are funded by shooting sports participants and recreational target shooters that aren't hunters. So it's really kind of done a complete 180 on where the majority of those funds are going. But hunters are really still an important role in this because most state fish and wildlife agencies like Nebraska utilize the number of hunters or the stamp and permit sales each year that hunters purchase to be able to access these funds. So the monies that come in for those permits and stamps that hunters buy, they utilize that as their match for the most part to be able to access these wildlife restoration dollars that are coming in on an annual basis. So those kind of pieces of legislation, along with a little bit of the history and kind of how we transitioned from a really big market hunting country to a country of regulation, conservation, managing our wildlife for the public and making sure that it's maintained for future generations, developed what is known today as the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation. There's 7 principles within this model that I'm going to touch on in a little bit more depth here, but one, wildlife resources are a public trust. Wildlife is owned by the public and held in trust by the government for the benefit of the people and the resource. So in this instance, owned by the state of Nebraska, where the Game and Parks is the overseeing agency that holds that trust for the public and manages it for the public, but also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Agency for the management of migratory birds also hold that the ownership of the wildlife in the public's trust as well. Contrary to the European model and some of the different models across the world, individuals don't own wildlife even if it's on their own property. So kind of a complete swing and really managing. Our goal as an agency is to manage the wildlife for everybody. Hunters are a part of that, but non-hunters are certainly also a part of that, and their invoice and input is certainly just as valid as the hunters' input and invoice. Number two, markets for games are eliminated. So I mentioned before the Lacey Act eliminated pretty much the unregulated markets for wildlife and game. And that really has led to a significant decline in wildlife populations. A lot of those species that I mentioned before, white-tailed deer, turkey, wood duck, and other duck species have rebounded tremendously since the Lacey Act and some of the management techniques that we're taking in here in Nebraska and across the country as well. And we also have laws that prevent selling of most wild game meat to unregulated markets. And then in some instances, you still can sell fur, for example, but these are still really heavily regulated markets to ensure that those wildlife populations are sustainable and that we're not going to overharvest them, even in the instance where some of those, such as fur, can be sold. The third tenet of that model is that allocation of wildlife is by law. So in Nebraska, we have state statute rules and regulations approved by our commission, including season dates, bag limits, sex restrictions, a lot of the methods of take restrictions. We have a pretty vast array of rules and regulations here in Nebraska, and most states do, because it takes a lot of oversight to ensure that wildlife populations are conserved year over year, and they adjust year to year. Our agency uses adaptive management, uses the latest research, information, public input to make those decisions. And how that works here in Nebraska, we have our state agency staff that makes recommendations to our commissioners that ultimately make the decision, and those commissioners represent 8 different districts across the Nebraska. But using sound research, population estimates, surveys, things like that to make those decisions and make those changes as they're needed to adjust to any fluxes in wildlife populations. And under that allocation, we're not allocated by market principles, landowner status. So everybody, the law doesn't restrict certain user groups from participating, again, in the public trust. And then we have a democratic process and public input. Each year, Nebraska has public input meetings. All of our commission meetings are open to public input and have opportunities for the public to weigh in on their experiences, their thoughts on how something should go, whatever the topic may be. So ensuring that process is equitable and that everybody has an opportunity to voice their opinion, because again, we're holding that wildlife in the trust of the public. The fourth one here, the wildlife is considered an international resource. That wildlife does not stay within state boundaries, certainly not within international boundaries. And then in instances of migratory birds, those populations are moving back and forth seasonally between different countries and different states. So that Treaty Act of 1918 helped establish how we work with Canada and Mexico and some other countries down the road on managing wildlife, especially our migratory bird species. And again, even within the states, we work often with other states on the management of mountain lions, pronghorn, some other species that may migrate from state to state in between Nebraska and other states. So even inside of the U.S., we're also working with the federal government and other states around us on those populations that don't stay within our borders. I mentioned this already, but really, to me, one of the more important tenets of this model is that science is a proper tool to discharge wildlife policy. The basis for the decisions I make, the basis for the decisions my colleagues make, and recommendations that they make are based on our best available science, research, information that we gather through surveys, through research, through harvest reporting from our hunters, habitat research, and using adaptive management principles to really adjust our policies, rules, regulations, seasons, things like that to ensure that our populations are going to maintain and sustain into the future, and constant evaluation and looking at that data and information that's available to us to make those decisions. And then the last one here is that the democracy of hunting is standard. So as I said before, in Nebraska, we have a commission. Some state fish and wildlife agencies have state boards. They're pretty similar, but a little different, that are politically appointed in a representative democracy, take input from staff, biologists, stakeholders, as well as the public, hunters, farmers, ranchers, landowners, any other interest groups in the general public that want a say, have a say in our processes here. And that's an important piece, because all those interest groups have different perspectives, different interests, and a lot, wildlife management, natural resource management in general is very close to the heart of many Nebraskans, many Americans. So it's important that they all have a voice in order to have a say in how we manage our wildlife. As I said before, we have 9 commissioners that represent 8 different districts across Nebraska, and then 1 at-large commissioner. Those commissioners are rotated and appointed by the governor for different terms. One of the pieces that I've touched on already a little bit was that hunters provide funding directly through their hunting permit and stamp purchases, but also indirectly through that excise tax through the Pittman-Robertson Act of their firearms, ammunition, and archery tackle. And this is just a quick snippet from total revenue sources here in 2022 for the Game and Parks Commission. And really between the hunting permits and stamps that are sold to our hunters, and also that reimbursements from the Pittman-Robertson dollars, make up the good chunk of our budget annually, and really are allocated in a way that we can utilize those funds to manage our wildlife through all those different methods I've mentioned before. So that's how hunters pay into our model of conservation, but really is a user-paid public benefit model. Those funds come in, we utilize a lot of that money for land purchases, habitat enhancement and development, research project, hunter education, as I mentioned before, our archery and shooting ranges that we provide to the public, with shooting sports and recreational target shooters being such a big funder of those excise taxes now. We've been expanding on our opportunities for education and archery and shooting ranges for those recreational target shooters to shoot in a safe environment, in a way that we can ensure that lead is not getting out into the landscape as well. A lot of these funds are primarily targeted towards game species, hunted species, but a lot of the work that we do, especially with habitat, benefits non-game species as well. And again, these efforts benefit non-hunters again through a lot of the work that we're doing out there on the landscape, enhancing wildlife habitat, creating opportunities for outdoor enthusiasts, campers, hikers, photographers, and the general public. And this is just a neat stat here. The National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is kind of an advocate for the shooting sports, trap shooting, skeet shooting, all the different cohorts of shooting, estimates that sportsmen and women contribute nearly $3.5 million a day to wildlife conservation. So the number is not small. I know I'm talking a lot about money here, but really a lot of the things we're able to do to manage our wildlife relies on hunters and shooting sports participants, and has a big impact on a lot of the ground work that we're able to do. Beyond just the funding source for conservation of wildlife, the other big one is that hunters are used as a tool for managing our wildlife populations, not only to what the habitat can hold, but also to socially acceptable levels. So There's not only research going on the wildlife side of things, looking at carrying capacities and population dynamics, how disease impacts certain wildlife species, drought impacts wildlife species, but also how those wildlife affect us as people and the ways of life, the different ways of life across Nebraska. So you'll see our depredation seasons, and depredation hunters are often used and primarily used to help reduce problem in overpopulated areas that are having some of those detrimental impacts, but our general hunting seasons as well. Wildlife managers, biologists utilize open hunting seasons to manage those wildlife populations, so they don't get above their carrying capacity. They don't cause more road collisions, disease, starvation, things like that, just to balance those wildlife populations to an acceptable level. Science and research. If you've hunted before, especially deer here in Nebraska, now turkey here in Nebraska, when you harvest or kill an animal, you're mandated to report specific information back to the game and parks that helps the biologists manage those populations, get data points, age, disease, size, different information off the animal that help them make decisions moving forward as well. Hunters are very involved in conservation organizations, as Chelsea mentioned before. I was previously with the National Wild Turkey Federation. A lot of these are nonprofit organizations, just like Conservation Nebraska, with different missions, but all that reside around conservation. Pheasants Forever and Ducks Unlimited. There's a lot of different organizations out there, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, both hunting based or just conservation based, that hunters provide a big role in advancing their missions as well, and working alongside state fish and wildlife agencies to help them achieve their missions together. And then habitat management. Hunters provide on their own land and non-hunters alike resources and develop their land for habitat for target species, and really creating a landscape that benefits wildlife as well. I know earlier I mentioned that the wild turkey really saw a dip, especially here in Nebraska. Turkey hunting was nearly non-existent, or was non-existent, and turkeys were nearly non-existent from 1915 to 1961 here in Nebraska, as a result of overharvesting, market hunting, utilizing turkeys for food from the pioneers moving and passing through Nebraska back couple hundred years ago. But in the 1950s, as a result of a lot of the funding that hunters were bringing in, turkeys were introduced back into Nebraska from Wyoming. And today we have a pretty robust wild turkey population, with turkeys being in every Nebraska county. And I'll talk a little bit more on some of the turkey population stuff as they're going back down a little bit. But really a big success story here in Nebraska that hunters had a critical impact on, and the funding of the ability to bring turkeys back into the state, proliferate them, and provide additional wildlife viewing and hunting opportunities for turkeys once again. Another one is the river otter. There's no record of the river otter in Nebraska, I think from 1916 to like 1970, 71. And then the late 80s, the Game and Parks Commission released about 160 river otters back into Nebraska over 7 waterways. And now there are an estimated 2,000 river otters here again in Nebraska. So another success story that's primarily funded by hunters, and their ability to do that was reliant upon hunters. This is just from our annual report here for 2022. I wanted to just give a quick overview. I know I've talked a lot about hunters and the money they provide, but taking a step back and looking at some of the things we're doing here as an agency to enhance and conserve our wildlife. One being an updated called the Bergeron Plan 2.0, a plan to enhance and improve pheasant abundance here in Nebraska. I know that's been a hot topic in the legislature here recently, but this plan is really aimed at improving the habitat availability for pheasants here in Nebraska. And it'll be a plan over the next several years here to increase that habitat, enhance the habitat that's already out there, and really create improvements that provide opportunities for pheasants out there on the landscape. Before I mentioned depredation with landowners and hunters being the primary tool that Game and Parks utilizes to solve for or address some of these problems. In Nebraska, we had an elk depredation season and hunters were used, but the Game and Parks constantly is working with private landowners to help ease some of those issues they're having with crop damage due to elk and other wildlife damage due to elk. And one of the things that hunters are certainly involved with in helping the agency manage elk as a public trust resource. Before I mentioned that there's some concerns, have been concerns over our declining turkey populations. This year, Nebraska Game and Parks made some changes, including some non-resident limits on the number of turkey tags, along with some other restrictions that limit the number of tags available to residents and non-residents, as well as how often you can shoot a turkey. So you can only shoot one turkey in a 24-hour period here this year. So not only providing opportunities for the hunters, and that will still be a part of the agency's, what the agency does, but really managing based on the populations. And if there's identified a problem, addressing that problem to the ability that will help our turkey populations, and also ease the social acceptability of what we're doing here as an agency. We're also kicking off a multi-million-dollar turkey research study with UNL and some other entities here too, to look at some of the reasonings for those turkey declines over the next several years here too. And then, as I mentioned before, the river otter was a big success in bringing back river otters here to Nebraska. And we actually had our first river otter season here in Nebraska, and in 78 were harvested in that 21-22 season after they reached that 75 quota. So again, pretty amazing stories that we went from having no river otters noted in Nebraska to now having the opportunity to manage those populations through hunting. But it's cool to see some of the things the agency is able to do with a lot of those dollars that hunters and other organizations and entities provide to rebound and conserve those populations and manage those populations at an acceptable level moving forward. I'm going to swing a little bit in a different direction here now, and kind of where we sit today. And from my role as a hunter education coordinator, I work really closely with our wildlife staff, but more as a program administrator for hunter education and hunter recruitment, retention, reactivation. Today in Nebraska, in 2022, Nebraska, we had 185,000 certified hunters. Remember that certified hunter number is involved in that formula for the money that come back from those excise taxes on firearms and ammunition. And this is really, over the past 10 years, maintained about the same. I think we peaked in about 1996 with over 205,000 certified hunters, but over the past 10 years, we've been relatively steady. We have roughly 1.3 million acres of publicly accessible lands here in Nebraska between our wildlife management areas, federal lands, as well as our open fields and water program that provide public access for hunting and trapping to private lands and landowners. In 2022, we had roughly $18 million here in Nebraska in hunting permit and stamp revenue, and then $17.8 million in wildlife restoration funds that came back to Nebraska to help manage our wildlife from those Pittman-Robertson dollars. And really, this is, as I said before, this has increased dramatically, largely due to the increase in purchases of firearm and ammunition that have nothing to do with hunting. A lot of the political landscape, as well as the growth of the shooting sports and recreational target shooting, are largely responsible for that increase in wildlife restoration funds that are helping us manage our wildlife. That being said, our hunter numbers here in Nebraska and a lot of states across the country are projecting and expecting that their hunter numbers are going to decline in the future for several reasons. Habitat loss and urbanization, as I mentioned earlier, that was already happening in the 1860s is really the number one thing decreasing hunting participation, and that being access to land and quality land to hunt animals. but our percentage of Nebraskans that hunt has already declined from about 13% in 1960 to 9% in 2022. Another concerning statistic is that the average age of our hunters is increasing, and we're not replacing the loss of those hunters with youth as we once did. And then we're also seeing some pretty dramatic declines, especially among older men in Nebraska. And here's just a quick shot at hunting participation, deer hunting participation in Nebraska over the years. So we've lost about 10,000 male deer hunters since 2010 to 2021. When on the bright side of that, we're seeing female participation increase, and you also see non-resident participation has increased here in Nebraska in deer hunting. What's really interesting about this is that the age distribution of our deer hunter has the average age in 2013 of our male deer hunter was 39 years old, and just 8 years later in 2021 that was just over 43 years old. And then those red circles there, you see that's showing the recruitment of youth deer hunters and the number of youth deer hunters participating that are male. And you see that we've lost almost half compared to 2013 and 2021 of those youth deer hunters. So we're seeing declines both on the male and female side there, but a little bit more drastic on the male side. And the same thing with our small game licenses and our small game hunters here in Nebraska. So our squirrels, rabbits, pheasant, other upland game has declined as well. About 10,000 male resident small game hunters less than we had just 10 years ago. And again, you see an increase in female participation. So female participation in hunting in Nebraska has actually grown by over 30% in the past 10 years, and really help offset some of these declines along with the increased non-resident participation. But forward thinking and looking into the future, there's concern that our hunter numbers are going to continue to decline, and there's concern that will impact what we're able to do as a state fish and wildlife agency to manage our resources in the public trust. And again, you see that youth participation declining for our small game hunters as well, from over 3,000 in 2013 to less than 1,500 there in 2021 on the male side of things. And that brings us to some of our efforts that we're doing to address hunting participation and continuation here in Nebraska. And that's, if you haven't heard it already, the recruitment, retention, and reactivation of our hunters, and along with some of our other outdoor enthusiasts and groups that I'll talk about here in a minute. But we're working to address a lot of those top barriers to participation, mentorship, access, and really the prioritization of people's times are some of those top barriers, and trying to address the ability for new folks that don't have the social support, that didn't come from a hunting family, provide them opportunities to get involved in hunting. We have goals to increase our public access for hunting and other recreational activities by 15% in the next 5 years. So we're taking steps and planning to try to provide additional opportunities for hunting and for wildlife habitat as well. And really just addressing the relevancy of hunting to all Nebraskans. Our landscape, our communities have changed as people come and go, as times change and technology advances, and trying to be more relevant as an agency to our potential customers and even our current customers, or customers that have been with us and maybe don't hunt anymore or don't participate anymore. We recently developed a 5-year plan, R3 plan, recruitment, retention, reactivation, to not only recruit, retain, and reactivate hunters, but also seeing similar things happen on the angling side of things, boating, park goers, and shooting sports participants. So taking an approach to provide lots of different opportunities for the Nebraska public and even non-residents that come in here to participate in what Nebraska all has to offer in the outdoors. And then just here are a couple of examples of things we've done. I know I mentioned access as a barrier, time as a barrier with waterfowl hunting. One of the biggest barriers for youth and new waterfowl hunters to get into hunting is identifying birds. And we have a traditional 6 duck limit, daily bag limit that hunters could harvest that had species and sex restrictions, and Nebraska has over 16 species of ducks that come through, all with different requirements. So last year in cooperation with South Dakota, we started a pilot of what's called a 2-tier waterfall program that hopes to make those regulations a little bit easier for folks that are getting started, to give them another option. Instead of the traditional daily limit with the species and sex restrictions, we provide an opportunity for a 3-day daily bag limit with no species or sex restrictions as they work to identify those ducks through harvest, but with a lesser bag limit, so they don't have the impact that they might have had if they were to shoot 6 ducks and not knowing what they're shooting at. Another program that we just launched here in Nebraska is learnhunting.org. I know before I mentioned mentorship as one of the biggest barriers for new hunters to get involved, that social support, somebody to show them the ropes after they take hunter education, get out in the field, scout, identify different habitats, and also understanding the rules and regulations and the different knowledge that you need to hunt. This platform is housed with our volunteer hunter education instructors who teach classroom courses. And if you're interested in hunting as an adult, you can visit this platform and find a volunteer instructor that might be willing to take you out in the field and show you what you need to know and mentor you to how to hunt whatever you're pursuing. So something we're excited about that just launched. So if you're interested in learning how to hunt and you're an adult, check out that website. It's just learnhunting.org. You'll provide a little bit of information, and then you'll see instructors in your area that are willing to take you out, and you can contact them through that website. One of the other ones you may have seen from the Nebraska Game and Parks here over the past few years is our Take 'em Hunting campaign, a marketing campaign that has encouraged our current hunters to take somebody new out hunting for a chance at prizes, to really provide an opportunity for folks to learn about hunting, how to hunt, kind of right along with our learnhunting.org, but in a different capacity, because we know it takes a hunter to make a hunter. And then here, lastly, I mentioned our R3 plan here just recently, and that's available. All of these things are available on our website, and I had them linked there. But we have a 5-year R3 plan. If you're interested in seeing what that entails, feel free to check out our website there and check it out. But outline strategies, priorities, and really how the agency wants to move forward in providing opportunities for our hunters to get involved and remain involved in hunting and all those other pursuits I mentioned before, and really create a future to inspire a diverse group of people to participate in our different outdoor recreational endeavors and remain advocates for conservation and a healthy environment here in Nebraska. So those are just a few of the things we're doing here in Nebraska to address some of these declines we're seeing in hunting, and why we see hunting as playing a crucial role, and it does play a crucial role in what we do here at the Game and Parks, and how we're able to do it because of the different hunters and shooting sports participants that provide a lot of the funding to fund our programs and to fund a lot of the research and habitat work and wildlife management that we do. So with that, that's all I had for you today. I'll open it up. I see we got a couple of questions here, Chelsea.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Susan, I'm sorry about this. Mine says chat disabled, but I can use the Q&A feature. Will we be sent a link to the recording at some point? Thanks. Yes, the recording will be up on our website within a couple of weeks, and we will let you know when that happens. And I'm sorry about that. Now, okay. And we have another question here. I would like to add that the market hunters aided the extinction of the passenger pigeon.
Sure. Yeah, there were several species I know that did go extinct as a result of market hunting prior to our current model of conservation, and as kind of that we turned into the 20th century was one of the reasoning as people started to identify that this was a problem, that we addressed it through added regulation, through the principles that I outlined here today. So absolutely, we're on a better path and a path that countries all over the world look towards into models of conservation.
Now I think are there any other questions anyone has? I don't see any other questions. I am going to put a feedback survey up. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to respond to this. This helps us with our planning and funding. So you go ahead and respond to the survey if you don't mind. And Hunter, that was just a very informative program. I really appreciate you've had all kinds of great information, and I know I learned a lot. So thank you for putting that together.
I'm glad you learned a lot, and my contact information is there up on the screen. If anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me. Be happy to continue the conversation beyond this.
Okay. I'll give people just a few more minutes to respond to the poll, and then okay. We do have a couple more questions here. Are there any other countries that we are learning from or teaching about conservation?
That's a good question. I think within the wildlife research community, there's a lot of international research going on for different populations in different countries, and looking at different species that are referred to or utilized or replicated by agency staff or researchers here with universities here in the US that can be certainly applied. I think there's certainly differences between the US and as you go continent to continent on different management practices and ways they do things. Obviously different funding sources for ways a lot of African countries have funding models that rely on tourism and trophy hunters that come in and pay large fees, and they utilize those monies to manage their wildlife. So there's certainly tips and research from other countries that are utilized here in the US, but applied more in our model of conservation.
Okay. When collecting data on animal populations, are animals that are hit on the roadway accounted for?
Yeah, so in modeling for populations and looking at population dynamics, there's a lot of research and white papers out there that identify the different fatality rates for vehicles in different regions and different populations of Nebraska and the US that are considered when setting quotas and how many animals could be taken during hunting seasons too. So mortality by vehicle are just one of many. Disease, predation, starvation, and other forms of mortality are all taken into consideration when our wildlife managers are making those recommendations on harvest for hunters.
Okay. Andy says that Argentina and Mexico are havens for dove shooting.
I haven't been, but I have certainly heard and seen the populations of dove in Argentina specifically. It's pretty impressive dove down there.
Okay. And what is the purpose of designated wildlife management areas?
Yeah, wildlife management areas are designated open to, for the most part, open to hunting and trapping and fishing to just create wildlife habitat for our wildlife, and an ability for wildlife to have areas kind of designated to live as urbanization expands on them. They're also open to other recreational activities as well. But really the focus of those is for the management of wildlife. And that's kind of in the name too.
Okay. Are there any other questions here? Okay, well, if not, I want to thank you again, Hunter. It was a very informative program, and thank all of our participants for attending. Keep an eye on the Conservation Nebraska website or Facebook to learn about upcoming programs that we'll be having. And thank you again, and have the rest of, have a good evening.
Yep, thank you, Chelsea. And I'll just add, if there's any questions that you might not think I could be able to answer, I'd be happy to route you to the right Game and Park staff to folks that are more intimate with a lot of the programs we run besides me too. So
Okay, thank you. And we've got
thank
your
you.
email here, so hopefully people got that if they're interested in contacting you.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
Thank you.